active.org. So let's give them a nice round of applause.
So we're talking about user-led innovation today, and I think we'll start off talking about what that means. When I first learned that I would be moderating this panel, I was thinking about Twitter, which is a platform I'm sure most people in this room use, 300 million users worldwide, and it's really been shaped in many cases by user adaptations. I think the hashtag is probably one everybody knows. That was a user-generated system for conducting ad hoc conversations and promoting events, and it became important during the Iranian election protests of 2009, and I think it actually took off during the San Diego wildfires of 2007 as a user was trying to update his community on the spread and containment of those fires, and eventually it became part of Twitter's official platform, and so that, wasn't invented by some executive sitting in a suite somewhere. And so that's one illustration, but we have a panel here today who have experienced and worked on other exciting and fascinating cases of users changing and adapting technology to suit their needs. And I think I'll start out with Carl, who has been involved in some health projects where open sourcing has been a significant part of the activities.
Yeah, thanks. So when we were discussing the idea of user-led innovation, I put forth the idea that one capability or one freedom that is important in user-led innovation is the ability to change something that you have received. And I think in the case of a physical product, for example, like a microphone or a watch, if you have the requisite skills, you can sort of change it. If you're talking about something like software, it's actually quite difficult to change a piece of software unless you have the source code, which is sort of the instructions in a language which tell the computer how to behave. And open source and free software is the idea that the ability to change that software and then redistribute those changes is granted to you by the creator of the program. And so I think the idea of open source is a very important enabler of user-led innovation because it gives people the power to not only be consumers of different software products, but also the ability to change those pieces of software and release the changes back to other users. So one example that the Rockefeller Foundation has been involved with for a number of years is called OpenMRS. OpenMRS stands for Open Medical Record System, and it is a system that was originally developed in Western Kenya at the Empath Center in Eldoret, Kenya. It's a collaboration between University of Indiana, the Partners in Health, and the Medical Research Council of South Africa. And this collaboration was started in 2006, and now in 2012, OpenMRS is used in over 50 countries, and there are over 450 developers who have contributed to the releases, the various releases of OpenMRS. And it is now actually one of the largest open source health projects in the world. I think for me, the compelling thing about the OpenMRS story is that the innovations that have been created, because of the way OpenMRS is structured, you can create new modules. New modules that have been created in Pakistan have showed up in Uganda, and new modules that Uganda has changed have ended up benefiting hospitals in Haiti. And this sort of networked, user-driven innovation is only possible, in my mind, because of this open intellectual property regime. It would be very difficult for the same thing to happen if it was a commercial private sector company that was running this piece of software. And this is not to say that I think proprietary software is the antithesis of user-led innovation. Twitter is a great example of proprietary software where people have innovated on top of it. But I think open source gives you a much greater degree of control and ability to modify. And I think it's an important thing to consider. So.
Well, just picking up on some comments that Carl was making, for the rest of the panel, in your experience, what kinds of conditions help or hinder users from creating adaptations and participating in the shaping of some of this technology. Does anyone want to speak to that?
Of course, I'm not going to be able to work the microphone. That always happens in a technology event. So my perspective will be very, very different in the sense that I represent the interests of the mobile industry, working in a public-private partnership, and I'm also not a technologist. But one of the things I always say in our work in M-Women, which is about closing the mobile phone gender gap and understanding that when this mobile revolution was happening and continues to happen across the world, it really just was about let's get as many SIM cards and phones in as many people's hands as quickly as possible. There wasn't an intentional design behind it to say, let's make sure rural people are included or women are included, et cetera. It was just basic business. And that basic business was based off of demand. You know, we all hear the standard, I call it the standard because everyone says it, you know, there's more phones than toilets in India, et cetera. It's because people want phones. And so there's something to be said in terms of user-led innovation about making sure that you focus on the demand that the consumer is putting forward. And when we're talking about development, it's really important for us to put the systems in place so we are doing that market research so we understand what that user is looking for. When it came to women, what we realized was that that type of segmentation just wasn't happening in the mobile industry in emerging markets. And it wasn't because anyone sat around and said, we don't like women. You know, it was just because there were a lot of other competing priorities at play. So when we went out looking for market research to say, what do women, underserved women, want out of technology so we can make sure that they're part of that innovation in that process, no one, and I shouldn't say no one, but at the face of it, not a lot of people knew. That research wasn't happening at scale. And so we recognized, working with USAID and USAID, that we had to go out and actually do that research ourselves. And we were chatting before, I come from a marketing background where when I worked with the likes of a Coca-Cola or Master Foods or et cetera, I knew what time you woke up in the morning, what music you listened to, what your favorite colors were. I knew everything about you, and I could design a campaign based off of that. The fact that I can't do that to help you have your child or, you know, get water access, the most basic and fundamental things, is insane to me. And so we went out and did that basic research, and we asked women living on less than $2 a day in Egypt, Papua New Guinea, Uganda, in India, just as a start. And we've taken all of our tools to do that research and made it open source and say, please, for the love of God, also do this work. And just asked women what they wanted in their lives and what their needs were. And often we found they didn't need, no one had ever asked them before. And so if we're talking about user-led innovation, like, you also have to be in a place where you know what you want so that you can get to it. So my point is simply that there are various institutions that we can look at to make sure this innovation is happening.
I wanted to turn the conversation to the question of what areas of technology are best able to generate the kind of user-led innovations that we're hearing about, and, you know, perhaps something about where the need is greatest and some examples of success stories. Kintara, I know you've worked on a program in India, I believe, Digital Green, which brings information and farming techniques to the agricultural community. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and what made the program successful. And, you know, we could also talk about failures too. I'm sure we've all had an experience with those, and why something didn't work.
I'm actually gonna do something a little bit different. So I'm often asked on these panels to provide a
user
counterpoint.
adaptation.
Yeah, user-led innovation. You know, I'm often invited to panels like this to kind of provide counterpoint. And I want to suggest that the way that this panel is currently framed, I think the topic itself is at best a romantic distraction, and probably something that we would all do, you know, better by working on other things that I think are far more important. So, you know, I'll break this down. So one is user-led, and then also information and communication technology, so ICTs. You know, both of these words often get used in the sense of people using the technology as Carl mentioned, as a consumer. And I would say that it's a great mistake to imagine that through the use of a technology, somehow that's going to dramatically change your life in the kind of ways that we're expecting in international development. I think it's much more productive to think of how can we help people become producers, not just of technology, but economically productive, productive in other different ways. And that concern, at least in the context of very poor communities, is a lot more about how do you help people become better educated? How do you help them get the skills acquire the skills that they need? It's a lot of what the speaker at lunch today spoke about with respect to helping communities find their aspirations and then helping them to meet them. And for a lot of reasons, I think that there's a tendency for us to believe that technology helps us do those things, but the reality is that technology is at best a consequence of the capacity to do that. All of us have smartphones in this room exactly because we have the kind of education that allows us to have the kind of jobs that allows us to pay for the technology. It's not that the technology in and of itself makes us fundamentally wealthy. And then the other theme that's run throughout the whole day is innovations. And I'm going to say something that is possibly controversial, which is that I think the whole idea of thinking of things in international development as innovative or not slices the pie in a way that is not fundamentally productive. It's not whether something is innovative or not that matters. It's whether it actually works or not that matters. There are plenty of innovations that don't work, and there are plenty of really, really old things that we know how to do that work terrifically, but for which there's not a lot of support. One of the things I really worry about is that in having an emphasis on innovation all the time, we're actually distracting some of the best and brightest and well-intentioned people in the world towards trying to continuously find new things to do rather than doing the stuff that we know works very well. And there's a tendency particularly around ICTs, for this to happen. With respect to, I think one of the difficult things is that this is all a question of balance. It's not that I'm fundamentally against innovation or even the use of ICTs, although sometimes I can come across as if I am. But the issue is really one of balance, and I think there's a tendency for the balance to shift too much towards the shiny new gadget and towards believing that minor adaptations that users make on their own is really the thing, when the real question is why don't they have the education to be able to be the next Mark Zuckerberg?
Well, that sort of raises a question for me that occurred to me when I was reading Kintaro's recent article in the Boston Review. The title of that was "Can Technology End Poverty?" I believe, which I recommend to everyone. It's a fascinating piece. And I was thinking about how user adaptations can work for ill as well as they can work for good, or sometimes they're just indifferent. I remember I was teaching high school in the mid to late 90s when a lot of technology was rolling into the classroom, and the way students would use it, bringing laptops into the classroom, for example, I thought was going to be this wonderful research tool, and I found out that actually my students were very clever in adapting it for their own purposes, which had nothing to do with my class. And you mentioned some of this in your article, experiences you had seen, I think in India, with centers and villages where people were using the computers provided by good-intentioned people for things like looking at porn or other activities which weren't really going to benefit anyone in the community. So I think that's an interesting counterpoint as well, and I wondered if anyone else could speak to that, if you've ever seen technology gone wrong in some way.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you go to Africa and you buy a SIM card and you put it in your phone, there'll be a little SIM menu, which is the sort of standard information services that are provided. And those services are like horoscopes and romance and like movie show times and sports scores and and I'm like, well, where's like the great health information? Where's the agriculture information? But it's not there because frankly, maybe the market's not there, or what people are willing to pay 2 cents a message for is the horoscope and the latest romance, soap opera line.
It's porn
and that's,
and Facebook.
but that's the market.
That's what the data, the commercial data is for porn and Facebook. And what I find really amusing for those of us who are working in development is why would we presume that people in other countries would be any different than our own country? Like every technological advance that's ever happened has been moved forward by the porn industry. And we may not want to say that, but that's just the reality of basic humanity. And so one of the other things we found in our research is we asked women if they wanted health information just to find out. 83%, really high number, really wanted health information. We asked them if they wanted it on their phone, and it dropped to 39%. And so we're also working from this premise that if we deliver it, they will, of course, want it. And that's in our own minds and not necessarily in theirs. And we haven't actually done the work of creating that demand creation to even get there. The other thing I would add to Kentaro's point is that we also tend to isolate ourselves onto one specific theme, forgetting how the themes fit together. It's one thing for us to, just talk about ICTs, but how does that then, one of the things we work on in the policy space is how do we just get the gender ministry to talk to the ICT ministry? That is fundamentally not even happening on the ground in most of the countries that we're working in, and that's probably true for a lot of other places, and so it's just important for us to make sure we look at the holistic options as well.
I don't have a concrete example of technology going awry from any of my case studies or anything. I think there are certainly circumstances and cases that a lot of us know about if you've been looking at the ICT for D field, where it's, the program ends up creating so much more work for the community healthcare workers, and they don't even understand how the program works. They don't even know how to SMS, and no one teaches them. And there are so many projects like that. But there are some that are great successes, and I think sometimes, like Kentaro was saying, it doesn't have to be fancy and shiny and new to work really well. I was actually reading about a case study recently in Africa where they tried to implement this mobile phone-based project. It didn't work, and so what they ended up finding was that, sorry, I'm a little spacey today, I'm sick. The healthcare workers weren't used to texting, weren't used to SMSing, so what they decided is they needed to be able to use numeric digits. That was the easiest thing, because for some reason that seems to hold, even if someone doesn't come from like a Gregorian language. And so what they ended up doing is creating this like dial where the person could spin it. It was a physical thing. They just held in their hand, and then it told them what 9-digit code basically to send, and that would tell them, the people who received the report, this is malaria, I found it on this day, and there were this many cases.
I think one of the romantic ideas that we all get excited about with these technologies is that it's going to be a great equalizer and reduce the gap between the haves and the have-nots. That was one of the great hopes of internet access. It still is. And I wanted to pose the question to the panel. In your experience, has this been the case, or indeed, in some cases, has it tended to increase that gap?
Yeah, so the theory I subscribe to with respect to ICT and development is that the technology is an amplifier of the underlying human intent and capacity that's already there. It's a very simple theory. It's one that often people kind of have in the vernacular. But I think it explains a lot of different things. One of them is, one of the questions I often ask people is, imagine that you and the poorest person that you have ever met both have a week to raise as much money for, your favorite charities, and that you have, let's say, a single mobile phone with unlimited text and voice and data to do it. Who would be able to raise more money? Who thinks that the poor person would be able to do it? Anybody? And who thinks you would be able to do it? Okay, so most hands went up for you. And the reason is because you have wealthier friends, you know how to use the technology in a way that is more likely to convince your friends to cough up some money. You have the kind of education that allows you to use these tools in an effective way, et cetera, et cetera. They're all things that are about you as a person and the social network that you're embedded in, not about the technology. In fact, you can replace the technology with, let's say, unlimited account on the internet, with Facebook, or with your favorite social media tool, or with tablets, whatever. Pick your technology, the outcome is the same. And the difference is something that is not a part of the technology. So I use that as an example to show that technology amplifies. And one of the consequences of amplification is that assuming an even spread of the technology, you're actually increasing inequalities. And I think that's something that we actually do see in communities, in environments where there's a lot of technology everywhere. For a lot of reasons, the technology itself often ends up unequally distributed, usually favoring people who are wealthy, educated, and in power. And then on top of that, those people know, they can use the technology much better. And so, without addressing the underlying socioeconomic inequality, the technology by itself doesn't necessarily fix the problem.
I think that that's where some of the most interesting innovation is coming in. I mostly look at Africa, so most of my examples are Africa-based, so I apologize if you're not interested. But within Africa, we're seeing a lot of growth of like innovation hubs and places that are trying to mentor and build the skills and capacity of Africans who, up until quite recently were probably lagging behind, and probably quite honestly still are in the tech capacity, code writing, the nitty-gritty tech stuff. And a lot of interesting innovation. I feel like if we're going to use the term user, perhaps we can use it very generally, as in the people that, if we're developing ICTs for development, if we're handing this technology to people, if that's the connotation, then I guess, those that are receiving it, the users. There is actually a lot of interesting innovation and entrepreneurs coming out of, especially like East Africa and some people in West Africa as well, and some very South African entrepreneurs that are building those skills and mentoring. It's really cool.
Trina, I thought maybe you could speak to this question as well, because as I understand it, what you're setting out to do, one of the intents of your work, is to close the gender gap with mobile phone technology and provide women with access to mobile phones. And so is it possible to sort of come in from the outside with a technology and really make a difference? Or as Kentaro is suggesting, is there a certain amount that has to be building on the ground and in the culture, and how does that interaction work?
Oh, absolutely. It has to be local. It has to be local. And the premise and the theory of change that we work from is first of all, we're not handing out 150 million handsets, because that's never going to work. What we did was we looked at the entire ecosystem, starting from the actual technology providers to the operators, but going down to the household dialogue. Because ultimately where the decisions around technology use and purchase happen are within the household. So some of our research indicates that the woman will be the third person in the household before whoever gets a handset. So it'll always, not always, but generally be the husband. In many cases, it will then be the firstborn son, and then maybe it'll be the woman. Now, meanwhile, we in development are out creating large-scale maternal health programs, but haven't yet had that conversation. I see Patty smiling in the background, because we talk about this all the time. What about the mother-in-law? There are very specific cultural dynamics on the ground that are at play that have to be addressed not necessarily through the technology, but before the technology can do the work that it needs to do. And if I may just add one other point in terms of the negative side, there's also some really scary stuff happening around domestic violence and how mobile phones can be used for not so great things, things that we heard in Papua New Guinea of husbands using it as a power tool. We hear in Iraq, husbands are asking for the call data records from the operators to see who the women are calling. So there's a whole host of things that we always say that it's not enough to have the handset. You have to know how to use it and be allowed to use it effectively before you ever reach impact.
And are you noticing a difference in the kinds of adaptations or desires for adaptations? Are you seeing a gender difference there? Women using phones for different purposes, perhaps in some cases, than the men in the community?
For women, it's about taking care of their children, dealing with emergencies, and making money for their family. It's very much so a necessity in that place. And I should say amongst women living under $2 a day, because those are the ones that we were looking at.
So I would just add a couple of thoughts to respond and maybe disagree with, maybe to add on to some of what Kentaro has said. I also agree with your theory about that the technology would amplify existing relationships. But I also subscribe to the theory that technology, especially information technology, when looked at over a long time horizon, it has a transformative effect on industries. And I think the best example of this is the financial services industry. That's actually a great example of where technology has both amplified existing relations in that it's definitely made it possible for the rich to get richer, but it's also totally transformed the way in which financial services work. And one thing it's interesting, because I'm involved in the mHealth field, and that we've said this many times, is that mHealth, when it is successful, the word is going to go away. Because we don't really talk that much in the financial services industry about like electronic trading or like, internet banking. It's just, they provide banking, finance, stock trading over any channel you want. They don't really distinguish between what's done with a computer, what's done with a mobile phone, what's done over a fiber network. It's all just part of how they do business now. And 40 years ago, it was all pieces of paper and guys yelling at each other. So it's completely transformed now, right? I think the same applies for the space of social action, right? And I know we can debate this, but I think there is a potential for a different sort of grassroots organization on a global scale that the internet, mobile phones, and so on have allowed that was not possible before this era. So it has also amplified the sort of social cohesion that brings people together in Rio to allow those conversations to happen on a global scale. And that, I think it goes beyond iterative change. That becomes transformative. But as you point out, this stuff can also be used for very bad things. Terrorists are using the internet for all sorts of nefarious things, for example.
I would ask you if you would maybe to define what the difference is now with the use of, for example, social media with or organizing protest or rebellion. I mean, there have been moments in global history, the 1840s, for example, when you did have these kind of rolling protests going from one city or even one country to the next. And so it's happened before, but what's different this time, do you think? And how is technology changing things?
I'm not a historian of revolutions.
This is my favorite topic to pick on, so I'll take this. So, there's this narrative, especially in the American press. It's actually surprisingly toned down in other countries, but in the American press about how the Arab Spring is fundamentally a social media revolution. In fact, earlier this morning, somebody used the exact words, I forget what it was, but Facebook, caused revolutions in Egypt. And I think this is one of the most prevalent myths, and it's one of the most dangerous myths in the sense that it gets people like Hillary Clinton to go up and say, okay, internet freedom is our new foreign policy doctrine. There's very obvious reasons why this is just not true. For example, you look at Syria, okay? This is a country that is still going through mass protests in spite of the fact that al-Assad has basically turned off the internet as of last June or July. And so, protesters are still managing to fight in spite of heavy military fire. And they're protesting and they're getting together, they're finding ways to communicate. Long ago there was this other revolution in which people used to communicate by, this method of one if by land, two if by sea. If the desire to protest is there, people figure out a way to communicate. It just so happens that the current modern way of communicating is Facebook or Twitter, and especially if you're outside of those regions, the way we get the news from these places is Facebook or Twitter, so we associate the revolutions with those tools. But for example, in Saudi Arabia, there was actually an attempt to start several protests on Facebook, and we've never heard about those, and that's because the Saudi monarchy has been very effective in not allowing any kind of civil society to thrive in the country, number one. And number two, they very quickly went after the people who were behind the Facebook organizations. And so, we never heard anything about it. It basically the protest was still born. And then the other side of it is that you have countries like China, where there are now 900 million mobile phone subscribers, close to 500 million internet users. If the fact of using social media was the cause of rebellion, then we should have long ago seen the Communist Party toppled. But Chinese people on the whole are reasonably happy, even though from the outside it looks like they don't have a lot of political freedom. But on a day-to-day basis, most people are not experiencing anything fundamentally negative in their lives, and so they're not about to protest. The cause of all of these rebellions is it's just basic political economy and politics. If the frustration is there, people will figure out a way to communicate. It might be that I'm sure in the next time there's a protest, there'll be another tool, another technology, and we'll then claim that the revolution was based on that technology.
Well, it's interesting for me to think about this. I did quite a bit of writing on Occupy Wall Street, and it's fascinating to consider that many efforts were made to kickstart some kind of protest in the United States for a couple of years, actually. And why did this particular one why did the spark catch fire? And it's interesting to consider that the call for action came through a very old media form. It came through an advertisement in a print magazine that went out, and then a physical protest in a park. That could have happened 100 years ago. And so it sounds like, to your point about amplification, that the social media was able to amplify what was happening, but it in no way was a cause. That it sounds like an example where that really fits. And to your point, there are places where protest is going on where social media has been shut down. And this point has been brought up about the technology backfiring in some cases on the users. It seems like there's this push-pull between citizens who are attempting to bypass or challenge corrupt government officials, and those same government officials finding clever ways to do things, as Carl noted, like tracking and surveillance. And so I don't know where we are with this right now. I mean, it seems like we're sort of sitting, there's a very fine balance, and it's a tightrope that we're walking, and it can go either way.
Well, I think the challenge is we're looking for a solution, and there's not a solution, there's many solutions. And so we're just trapped in this space to say this is the thing. And so I think the more that we can, take Kantaro's point, but also look at what Carl is saying, is that there's huge value to technology. I don't think we're all sitting here having this conversation and have these jobs because there's huge value, but how do we make sure we don't get stuck having an isolated conversation? We should have probably been a part of other panels throughout the day talking about various other topics as opposed to just having one panel about technology. And I don't mean that in any sort of offense to anyone who planned this session, but just in thinking of how do we move forward from just having the tech panel, but making sure that technology is a platform that we build from whatever our goals may be.
It does occur to me that perhaps one difference between how technology is being used now in global protests or rebellions, at least it may make things happen, or not make things happen, but amplify things more quickly. In the 1840s, you had to wait to find out about what was happening in another city, and news traveled pretty slowly in some cases. Although, interestingly, faster than one would think. But still, today, I get the sense that one could at least say that the amplification happens faster. I mean, will you grant that one?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Any other differences you see in, just to be your own devil's advocate?
I mean, I would, so going back to Carl's point about, and Trina's point about, the technology having a transformational effect. So, I'm not saying that the technology doesn't change things or that it doesn't fundamentally alter things, but that it's changing things on an axis that is not the main concern of, I think, most of the people in this room who really want to see a positive social change. I mean, the important thing of social innovation is not the innovation, it's the social, both in the sense of it being human and also in the sense of it being a social cause. I'm all for, amplifying with technology people who have that mission and using the technology in a way to achieve something. But the subtle distinction between that and imagining that the technology causes a social transformation is subtle but huge. And I think the tricky thing is that we tend to associate these kinds of things they look the same when you go on a project by project basis. You're like, okay, here's a great organization, they're using technology. But the important thing is to realize that if there is positive impact, you need that human side first before the technology also contributes, something positive.
Yeah. I would agree with that, but I think so. Yeah, I don't know what the point of view of all the people in this room is, or what exactly they're all interested in. I know that when I was at SIPA, my favorite book was Development is Freedom by Amartya Sen, and the main thing I took away from that book is the idea of increasing the number of choices should be the goal. So if people have more choices, if they have more freedoms to live the lives they choose to value, then that's always a good thing. It doesn't necessarily mean the sort of standard, let's build them a dam. Okay, go ahead.
So I'm actually writing a book where I'm challenging that thesis.
Jeez.
All right, so no, but this is, I think this makes it an interesting conversation. So I'll pose the following question. Okay, so think about people down the street in that direction. I believe, Wall Street bankers. What is that right?
Wall Street. Which way is
Wall Street? I think Wall Street, isn't it? Okay, maybe I'm wrong.
It's everywhere.
Anyway,
Kantaro.
I see the sun over there. So
Where's
anyway,
the business school?
So think about Wall Street bankers, okay? These are people who probably have more options than anybody in this room. Okay, they have more freedom than anybody. They have more wealth than everybody. They have more power than everybody. Whenever there's a question of justice, it tends to lean in their favor, right? You could argue that other things that we want in development, they have in spades. And yet, these are the same people who are, arguably responsible for a lot of the ills of the modern world out of proportion, in proportion possibly to their wealth, right? So if freedom is the sole goal, then I think there's a fundamental problem. And one of the reasons why this is such a hard point to make, and why I think even Sen fell into this trap, is that it's not that freedom is fundamentally bad, it's that it always needs to be balanced by responsibility. And responsibility is something that is just not, it's not something that you can necessarily legislate, and so you can't say we don't want freedom, we need to legislate responsibility instead, and yet it's something that society needs. And so it's very hard to argue for, it's very hard to deal with it through policy, but I don't necessarily agree that maximizing freedom is the right thing. I mean, that means a whole lot of other things about what we're allowed to do with each other that I don't think is necessarily makes for a better world.
Can I make a slightly less controversial point? One of the things for me personally, and one of the things that I think draws people to our program is a question of scale. There is no doubt that through mobile phones distribution and the fact that there are so many, it doesn't mean that there's a gap between scale and impact, but the example that I always give is that how much does it cost you to build 10 clinics, and how much does it cost you to send out maternal health information to 100 million women? Now, I don't think that's entirely for debate, and there is a question, but I don't think we should take away from the fact that we can fundamentally talk to and reach billion people, literally more than we've ever been able to do, and there's just something to be said for that.
I totally agree. The only thing I'd say is I think that mobile technologies, at least in development, do much better when they're paired with something else. Like getting the SMS reminder to go have a prenatal visit is very important, but you have to go have a prenatal visit somewhere. So the scalability is there, but we need to make sure it's still culturally relevant to the places where we're trying to implement the program, and it usually does seem to work best as part of a group of services. I was going to say something else, but it's gone now.
Agree completely.
So I just wanted to go back to the freedom point, and the second point I wanted to make around that was that going back to the topic of the panel, which is on user-led innovation, I think the most important thing for me, besides what we've talked about already, which is sort of like people having the capacity and the ability to innovate, is that somebody is listening and actually willing to react as a result of something some user has done out in the world. And so I'll give you an example of a user-led innovation where somebody listened and it changed the world. So this is a story from about, I don't know, probably 100 years ago, during the early days of the telephone. And the telephone, when it was first, and I know Patty's heard this story before, so sorry, Patty. When the telephone was first marketed, it was marketed as a business tool. It was for businessmen to communicate business things to each other. And then they started to put telephones in houses for women who were staying at home in the houses, so that they could order things from catalogs. So it was sort of like Amazon in like 1912. So the women would have a catalog and they could order something. And then what happened is these women started calling each other, and they started talking to each other, having social conversations. And there were newspaper articles written at the time that were saying that these women were sort of taking up precious telephone time with their idle chit-chat. Because the people who had invented the telephone didn't really know what it was. And this is, I think, a standard thing in technology, is that the people who invent the technology don't really know what it's for. And in this case, they didn't understand that the telephone was really a tool for social communication. And it was these basically housewives who decided that the telephone was really a tool for social communication. And that changed the whole industry once the telephone industry listened to that and decided to try to market this as a different sort of tool. So, and then, 80 years later, the same thing happened with Japanese schoolgirls, discovering texting and pagers, and there's a whole paper on that. But it's, I think the important part of that story is you have to be willing to listen and pay attention to what the users are doing, and then change what products you're developing based on that in order to adapt to what the users feel is valuable. That's the only way to get that freedom. But I don't know how to add responsibility.
So, yeah, you guys are tempting me into becoming the least popular person in this room. So, I mean, both of the comments that Trina and Carl made touch on this question of scale. And again, if you take the theory that technology amplifies human attention and capacity, then I think the unfortunate irony of trying to use technology in international development is that exactly in those places where you most want the technology to have impact, the human capacity and institutional capacity to take advantage of this technology is missing, and therefore you don't get the scaled impact, which is exactly why we have yet to see a widely popular health information app that people are willing to pay for. So I think scale is again one of these buzzwords that we hear all the time that's along the lines of innovation, where in our desperate desire to reach hundreds of millions of people, what we're doing is delivering very thin solutions that possibly change a few people's lives in a very minor way, instead of going after quality interventions that take place on a smaller scale. If everybody, I think there are about 100 people here. If everybody in this room went off and did what Banco Palmas did, that's 10 million people impacted in the way that they did. If instead all of the people in this room decide to go after an interesting mobile app, I can guarantee that nothing of that nature is that kind of transformation is going to happen. But you will all be able to say you reached 100 million people.
Wow. Okay. The gloves are off. Okay. So I was not prepared for this, but what I will say is that just based off of what you just said now, my feeling is that you're not giving the people in the countries who we are working with enough credit. Because when I spent 3 years in South Africa working with young people around HIV prevention, and they designed a product with us that was already, the organization was already reaching millions of people, but that they came up with the solutions themselves because that's what they wanted, because they were living in a space where they didn't have access to anything else. And I think creating tools and solutions that help, the fundamental platform that we come from in terms of the Women campaign is that most of these women are not allowed access to information. They are not allowed access to understand what might happen outside their families, what education they could get, or any of those sorts of things. So having a private platform where they could actually find out about reproductive health care rather than husband, physically raping them in marriage to have children is of huge benefit on the other side. So I think to take it to that extreme, that if everyone in here did a mobile app, they wouldn't benefit anyone, is a little bit.
So, let me say why what you were just describing right now is actually the right kind of use of technology. You mentioned that there was an organization that was already reaching millions of women. Right there, that's the cue that's a kind of organization that you want to help with, whether it's through technology or through policy help or whatever else. The real problem is that organization does not exist in everywhere else in the developing world, where you might want the same app to actually work. And so this is what I mentioned as far as the subtle distinction is concerned, is that the advice I always give for people who are interested in technology for development is that your best bet is to find an organization that is already having the kind of impact that you were hoping for, and then to help amplify their work through the technology. But if you take the results of such work and then imagine that you transfer the technology elsewhere and see the same impact, that almost never happens. In fact, I've never seen that happen in the absence of that underlying organization.
Agreed. But teaching the skills that you were talking about before in terms of teaching coding and all of that, it's going. Just because it doesn't exist in terms of the skill set required to get that user-led innovation doesn't mean it can't ever exist.
Oh no, I agree. I mean, if anything, I would say, I think the more all of us work on mentoring other people to to be able to do the things that they want to do, the better. But usually that mentoring is, again, it's a social process. It's not one that you can easily deliver over text messaging.
Sure. Agreed.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on scalability. And I mean, I come from an international development background, and I sometimes get so frustrated with myself and with my field because I feel like we keep doing this. We keep trying to take this one thing that worked in one place and do it in other places, and it doesn't work, a lot of the time. So I'm totally with you. Like, I think that oftentimes the best solutions have to be very localized or have to be very specific to the context. But then I also agree with Trina in some respects, and going back to what I was saying, and I think that the best thing that we can do is build up capacity or enable others to build the capacity within their own community, train the trainers. I love the mentoring programs that you're seeing in East Africa where Africans are training other Africans how to code or do different things.
Yeah. So I agree with all of that. I agree with the need to have local adaptation, local customization, yada, yada. So, but let me bring this back to the ideas I put forth about open source. Okay. So OpenMRS, this platform I mentioned earlier, it has, I think, 3.9 million lines of software code. So when you download OpenMRS, and that, if you were to spend, if you were to hire some developers and write that, it would take you, I think, something on the order of like 5 person years to write that, and about $5 million. So when you download OpenMRS, you're sort of getting 3 million lines of source code for free. And then you can change maybe 10,000 lines to make it do what you want, but you don't have to invent the other 3 million. Right now there's this sort of development industrial complex that we are all sort of part of. And I know, for example, that the World Bank has a portfolio of over $1 billion in ICT for health projects. And the bulk of those solutions that have been developed are developed by contractors, many of which are not based in the countries. And the solutions are kept as proprietary, which means that the countries which are acquiring these solutions have no right or ability to change them. So that's why I think if we are paying for software to be developed and we want it to be customized locally, open intellectual property is absolutely essential, because otherwise you're going to have large commercial companies that are just sort of profiting off of these kind of big contracts from the World Banks of the world, as opposed to enabling local people in Ghana or Uganda or whatever to customize and maintain these solutions over the long term for their people.
Can I just add, what that points out to me is that one of the things that's sort of the elephant in the room that we never talk about is that the institutions that are trying to catalyze ICT for D don't actually have the technical capability to understand what it is they're doing. And so that's one of the things that I find, I'm generally a consultant, and I find that's what I end up doing. It's like, this is what USSD is, and this is how it works. And so before institutions put forward billions of dollars for something, there has to be almost our own internal capacity building to say, we don't know what we don't know, so let's not push something forward just because it's sexy. And I love the fact that we do women and tech, so we're super sexy, but I'm always saying that let's just take a step back and be realistic. One of the places where we can help amplify further is I was part of a technology delegation from the State Department to Liberia and Sierra Leone, and one of the things we were talking about was the underwater cables and just broadband access, and some of the mistakes that are being made by governments in terms of ensuring that there's open access through those cables. We've been looking at programs separately with the State Department as well about universal service funds that are not being used well. How do we influence those policies so that they can be used well to make these things happen? Those conversations, I think some of us were at the first Mobile Active conference in Johannesburg where we didn't really know what was going to happen. Those types of conversations I feel like are just happening now. So there's something to be said about the moment of time where we're headed, because up until now it's just been pilots and things and throwing things against the wall, and now I think we have a better sense of which ones are actually sticking at some level.
I just wanted to talk a little bit in response to your open source discussion, which is to say that I think open source technology is really important, and I think it's one part of what could be I think it can be one part of looking at this. But I'd say the only thing from what I look at that's troublesome about open source is that at the moment a lot of Africans don't yet have the capacity or the skills to participate in even open source coding. And so then they're left out of the process a lot of the time. And so then if they're not even involved in the open source solutions, then they're left out of the solutions, which is problematic. They can then be catered, a lot of them, like the OpenMRS and OpenRosa projects like EpiSurveyor and stuff. But a lot of Africans don't currently possess the skills to even do that. So then they're left out of the process entirely, And then also we see that as they're building those skills, that can be pretty time consuming, and it's a very profitable field. And so to expect them to then start an entrepreneurial venture and not want to make any money back might not be realistic or fair to those people.
Just wanted to ask a question, and we can come back and see you've got a point to make, about evaluation as well as regulation and policy connected to innovation. We were mentioning Wall Street a moment ago, and you could argue that Wall Street innovated us into a financial crisis, innovated the money right out of our pockets. I interviewed a fellow from Goldman Sachs a couple years ago, and I asked him what was the thing that went wrong culturally at Goldman Sachs, and he said, oh, it was the desktop computer in the 80s. That's what changed it for the worse, because bankers who thought long-term, their sort of cultural dominance was replaced by traders who could suddenly do short-term trades. They were no longer looking at human beings while they were doing those trades. And so there's sort of an amplification of the worst aspects of the culture. And that's, of course, very dangerous, and it's also very difficult for regulators in this country and elsewhere to keep up with the innovations that are happening and try to contain them, try to channel them into paths that are, have some kind of social benefit or at least, prevent social harm. So I wanted to ask a question about that
Well, just one sort of tangential story, but just to indicate sort of how crazy is the use of ICT in that industry. So right now they're laying a fiber cable from Chicago to New York, and they're cutting through hundreds of miles of rock in order to lay this cable that's like more straight as opposed to being kinked. And the point of this multi-million-dollar cable is to shave like 1 microsecond off of a transaction time. I mean, because obviously New York can talk to Chicago, but by shaving off 1 microsecond, they can gain some useful advantage. I mean, that's so far away from the world of international development but there's guys out there cutting through a rock right now just to shave that 1 microsecond. So it just goes to show how far advanced they are in the use of ICT. But it's become perverted, I agree.
I mean, the financial sector would be the one place that is probably most obvious. But I would imagine, sounds like from what all of you were saying, you have to have the technological know-how when you're doing development, but you also have to have the cultural understanding so that you make sure that you're not amplifying something that's detrimental to that community.
Well, and I think what I heard you ask was a question about evaluation. And I think there's a broader question around monitoring and evaluation frameworks that actually fit within this new world that we're working in. And I don't pretend to know the answer. We're currently working on our M&E right now, and it's not as, I don't believe impact is I sent out 1 million SMSs. Like, that just does not work. But those are the metrics we've been using because those are the metrics that exist. Nor do I believe, in terms of in healthcare having 10-year-long randomized controlled trials are particularly effective, because in those 10 years we'll have brand new technology. And so I think you've asked the right question. I don't pretend to know the answer. I think that we all need to sort of ask ourselves what's the right way to measure impact in a world where things are changing very quickly.
I don't have an answer either. I would say that I think that some of the keys moving forward are, trying to, I think as Trina was talking about in an example that Kentaro appreciated, that they had partnered with an organization that was already working on the ground and already knew the area. So I think a lot of it has to do with smart partnerships and local knowledge paired with what makes the most sense in the context. And hopefully moving away from this idea of mobile technology for development, so much as mobile can be a tool within the toolkit of somebody who's interested in international development.
Okay, with that, I think we'll open up questions to the audience. And yeah, I see a hand back here.
First of all, I wanted to make a comment on what you said about Wall Streeters and responsibility. And I think it was very interesting today. I think it was you, one of the panelists was asked, what is the big idea that you want to see happen? And one of them said empathy. So I think a lot of it is also how do we educate the new generation? How do we, as a community and as a society, really change the principles and the goals and what we value? And I think Martha Nussbaum actually expands the framework quite usefully in that sense when she talks about ethics and when she talks about our responsibility as a society and the value that and taking care of people who are going to take care of themselves, etc. That's one point. The other thing that I think is very interesting about technology in whole, which will be interesting for us to look at, is a little bit what Carl mentioned. How do we use technology as a new model? So when we talk about open source, about agile development, and start thinking, and I think that's what makes it so interesting that now we have technologists and designers talking about things that we all know are useful, opening up the framework, doing system design, understanding that we don't just parachute a solution, whether this is technology or a livelihood project. So it's not just technology projects that are ill-conceived. I lived in Afghanistan for a year, and I cannot tell you how many ill-conceived projects I saw, very, very well-intentioned, but not in a system, not understanding the cultural parameters, not understanding, not doing the due diligence of who else has done something that failed, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, maybe to all of you and the panelists before, every single panelist talked today about local community, about users, about listening to people, about having this feedback loop. And we as people in the design and technology development community are very value that. And I think that's why now people think, oh, technology will solve the problems of development. Design thinking will, and it won't, the way that any other panaceas we thought in the past 40 years haven't changed it. But since everybody here has talked about the importance of local community, local voices, why do we keep getting it wrong? Are we all in our own bubble and nobody else listens? And it's so obvious, and yet we're not doing it.
Well, I think there are people who are doing it. At lunch, we saw a very good example, I would guess. I think the real challenge is that, in fact, many of the centers of power actually veer away from anything small, local, time-consuming, anything requiring a lot of human beings doing, things that may not materialize in anything measurable for 10 or 20 years. And again, it goes back to, I would say, your point about ethics and so on. I think a lot of it is that, some of our most powerful organizations are more interested in being able to take credit for whatever impact they have, rather than actually having, real credit. And it's really just a question of, I think some of it's personal maturity, or as an organization, organizational maturity in some sense. But, I think that's exactly the kind of thing that, as individuals, we all have to fight against, and it's very difficult to do. I mean, I feel this pressure myself. When when some foundation decides they're going to start a new project where there's going to be millions of dollars in funding, it's very difficult to say, okay, I'm not going to chase after that thing and stick to whatever it is that I believe in. But one thing that I have seen is that the people who are closer to the ground can push back against that tendency, even among organizations that appear to have power. So most of us are always talking about how let's say smallholder farmers need to group together and fight back against their governments and so on. I mean, I think we have to do that as individuals who are interested in development against the larger institutions that control a lot of the flow of funding in international development. It's just as worthwhile for us to fight against those powers as it is for a farmer to fight against the local corrupt government.
One of the things I always tell my team is our job is to work ourselves out of a job. And that at the end of that, I'll help you find another job. But one of the things I found being very new to the development space is that the systems seem to be set up for people to perpetually stay where they were. And so, to Kantaro's point, that basic human behavior, if you're incentivized to stay where you are, then you're going to continue to do that. And I've also learned recently a lot about all of the political dynamics in development that, frankly, I didn't understand before. But, I want to ask Carl a question, coming from a foundation, how do we work with the money flow in a way that it does incentivize the types of things that, we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I wrote down 2 words: centralized funding. I mean, I've always felt at the end of the day, if you want to understand a system, you just look at the money. If you look at how the money flows, then you'll understand how the system works. And I think, let's take global health, for example. 50% of global health is a single institution, which is USAID. And then 80% of private global health spending is a different institution, which is the Gates Foundation. So there's a lot of people playing in global health, but there is also a massive centralization. And if we want to fund 2,000 small community banks all over East Africa, the amount of paperwork it would take for USAID to do that, or even the Rockefeller Foundation, would be impossible. And so what ends up happening is you give one big grant to some American NGO. And that's just often the way it works. I mean, I've given grants to groups in Africa, to groups in Bangladesh, to groups in Vietnam, to groups in the US. And because of the IRS tax laws, it's a lot easier to give a grant to an American organization. Because if I give a grant to a small African NGO, they have to prove through all sorts of documentation that they're a charity. Even if they don't even have two nickels to rub together. They have to do all this work to prove who they are and what sort of financial capacity they have. So oftentimes it's just much easier, and in some cases with USAID, I believe it's even somewhat difficult for them or impossible for them to give money to contractors who haven't met a certain standard. And if you're some small community bank, you're never going to meet that standard. So I think there's also a question of how do we change the way the funding flows, and how do we change the laws to make it more permissive to allow us to easily give money directly to local organizations. I mean, we can do it, we do it all the time, but it's a lot more work.
I think the funding is a key part, and I think that it's great to have somebody from a foundation on the panel, because I think oftentimes you guys aren't in the same room as us. We're having these debates that are almost too idealistic or something without looking at where the money flows from. The only thing I'd add is I think that it's come up before. I think part of why we don't end up listening to end users is I think that we oftentimes do look for solutions that can be scaled up or try to scale up something that's worked once. And I think that there's oftentimes something that's lost in trying to simplify something and take it somewhere else or replicate it. And part of what's lost, I think, is the feedback loops or the agile iterative process.
And the only thing I would add is that I've heard the term demand-driven development thrown around a lot. I don't, in my personal experience, have not seen that systematically in place. If you look, I mean, I can only throw out, the one book that I always think of, which is White Man's Burden, around this. Like when I worked in the commercial space, there were systematic things so that I would always know what was working and what wasn't working. And I've never seen that in development. I'm sure it exists in certain places, but in order for us to even start doing what you're talking about in terms of agile development, then we need to be consistently getting feedback so that we can make that happen. And the classic example is the malaria net story, right? Like, let's just throw malaria nets at people and they're using them for bridal veils or fishing or whatever. We have to ask the questions of what people want and not assume that we know what they want.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for the very controversial conversation. I appreciate that. And in terms, one thing that was mentioned was with the government and regulation of these technologies, specifically with the financial schemes. But I think in general, we have nobody from the government or from the government agency on the panel right now. And I know Trina mentioned that when you're working with different government agencies, the first thing you have to do is go and explain to them what the technology actually does. So how are agencies supposed to try and regulate these technologies when the knowledge and capacity of what the technologies might be used for is not within those organizations?
I'm going to just try and think about how to say this. Well, there are two different things, right? So if you're talking about regulation, for example, just here in the US, we're talking about Congress, and I think there's certainly a number of people who are working. We've seen a number of controversies come up of late in terms of recognizing that Congress isn't there yet, and people are trying to address that. What I don't know is how to do it fast enough, because just the congressional process in and of itself is so much longer than whatever new technological advance may come up. What I was referencing was more in terms of in the development space. Things have been done a certain way for a very long time, and I've been learning to become a much more patient person than the New Yorker in me is, in the sense, like, people don't want to do anything until someone else has done it well. right? And so what I have been seeing happening a lot of is a willingness and an openness within large scale, whether it's the UN multilaterals or USAID and AUSAID, who are our partners, to say, come in and teach us and work with us and partner with us, and we want to make what you do successful. We are funded by USAID. And I hear, someone wasn't too excited about USAID earlier in the day, but, to Maura's credit, who is here, Maura saw an opportunity in using a commercial proposition to make social impact, and she pushed it through. It really was her vision. She said, no, listen, we're going to do this. And she has also opened up this division to say, come in, explain these things to us. Let's look at capacity building. It's built into our grant to look at opportunities for knowledge sharing and capacity building at the mission level. So I think there's an acknowledgement that exists, and that there's a question of time in terms of building that capacity as well.
I think that we should also, I'm not sure if I totally understood the question, so I might be going on a tangent, but I think we also have to be careful with who we want regulating these technologies anyway. I think that it's been shown that plenty of governments are willing to do ill with this technology, and I think even the ITU is a UN agency, and that means that in the end, they're at the discretion of the UN body, which contains some governments that are already doing ill with their knowledge of this technology. So I think we have to be careful about who we want regulating this technology. I think it's an interesting but probably very separate conversation.
One thing I would add is that the technology often eventually takes care of itself. I mean, I would say that the fact that there are 6 billion mobile phone accounts shows just how much the technology industry is able to take care of itself. Whereas many things like just universal quality education or healthcare are not being taken care of by themselves. And so again, I would say whatever blocks there are in the technology, eventually the industry will figure out a way around them. But these other blocks are not being addressed to the degree that they need to. So again, the people who care need to really work on those things. So I think a lot of it is a question of opportunity cost. It's not that I think we shouldn't have mobile phones everywhere, but for anybody who really cares about what's happening for $1 a day farmer, that the other issues are really more pressing.
Next question.
I've been neglecting this side of the room, so I'm going to come over here and.
My name is Maputi, and I'm currently on spring break, but my sister invited me to come here and listen. I'm an undergraduate student at West Virginia University, and I'm doing biometric systems and computer engineering. I'm a South African, and I just want to speak on what the lady mentioned before about the importance of education, of educating the new generation. Last year, I had an extremely sobering experience. I worked in South Africa during my summer break. Instead of going to Cancun with my friends, I decided to go back home and work with an NGO that is located in Edendale Hospital in a province called KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. And the name of the NGO is called I Teach. And we're basically, I was working in a hospital that has patients who suffer from the dual epidemic of HIV and TB co-infection. And during my time, I was exposed to both the benefits and the detrimental impacts of having technology. My main focus during my internship was to study the TB diagnosis at a public hospital in a high HIV burden area. And very shocking results in that there's a test called the acid fast bacilli test. It's called the AFB test. The WHO, the World Health Organization calls it a gold standard test, but it fails a lot in an environment where people suffer from the dual epidemic. In that the test was used to diagnose the presence of TB in HIV and TB co-infected patients. Now the problem with that is patients who have both TB and HIV are, extremely immunosuppressed, and the test is not very good in detecting the presence of TB in people who are who have HIV. So as a result, patients would go to the hospital, get to this test because they had to cough into a sputum bottle. And those who are HIV infected, they don't shed enough bacteria in order to be detected under the microscope. So people would be released from the hospital, not knowing that they had TB. So they would go back to their communities without having initiated TB treatment. And I had to do call families, in order to, for my studies, I had to call families and find out about patients who had been released from hospital and had not received accurate results. Almost half of the people that I was studying were dead because of a technology that failed them. Now imagine, I'm an undergraduate student, I'm a freshman, I'm supposed to be woohoo, having all this fun, but I'm being exposed to that type of thing. And it worked on me mentally because I was like, okay, I have a government and, places such as MGH, they have these good technological tools that are supposed to help people. Say, for instance, if this patient had been a TB patient in a Massachusetts General Hospital, they wouldn't have died because the right technological tools would have been there for them to be diagnosed correctly. So that was the negative side that I experienced from technology. But then at the same time, speaking on the using mobile phones and technologies that are localized in order for the betterment of people, I was exposed to this research that at the I Teach Foundation was doing. They're creating something called the self-test toolkit for HIV, AIDS, in that a person can take it to his or her own household in order to test whether or not they're HIV positive. And they used it in collaboration with mobile phones, in that they would call a counselor with the information listed in the packet with very good instructions that would have been understood by a person who has primary school education. They would look at the pamphlet, call a particular counselor, and communicate with them in terms of understanding what it means in order to live a lifestyle of an HIV positive person. So you have the pros and cons of having technologies, but you shouldn't say that these are thin solutions that don't affect people's lives in a major way, because they definitely do. I've been affected. I mean, this year I've decided that I'm now going to work with the National Institute of Health to do more HIV research and go back to South Africa and continue to invest in the well-being of my country. So I just wanted to share that experience with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Questions?
I think I can just yell my question. And it's really interesting that she's studying biometrics, because South Africa was a leader in biometrics and has a history, a long history rooted in apartheid. And so I was curious how you guys think U.S. culture is embedded within information and communication technologies as really the forerunners of this particular technology. Because sometimes it's difficult to separate how technology is used and speaking to the mic. Yeah, no problem. Sometimes it's difficult to separate how this technology is used in the culture from which it came.
So it's interesting that so I worked with Love Life in South Africa, it's the largest HIV prevention organization there, and to your point around sort of U.S. centric pieces, what I worked on with them was a mobile social network designed to help young people ask questions to each other, as opposed to there was always a nurse around, because so much of those social interactions were happening anyway, right? And then in KwaZulu-Natal, one of the things we found was that it was about, it wasn't just about the fact that people didn't want to get tested or they did get tested, it was unemployment, it was all of these other things, right, that worked around that. And then I met USAID, and I was working with a non-USAID funded organization, and I was trying to learn sort of how does USAID's role in because they do fund the majority of the people who get treated for HIV in South Africa. So how would that influence the M4D space and the ICT4D space? And I think one of the things that I would say is that ultimately institutions are made up of people, and that the people within, what in my experience really did take the time to try and understand what was appropriate in that local context. I think, and similarly, I was part of this State Department delegation around, which is a part of Secretary Clinton's Internet of Freedom sense. And I think that we just have to be careful not to make large-scale observations that the U.S. is trying to push technology down or not, but just look at it from each specific situation. You know, Jared Cohen got in a lot of trouble when he spoke to Twitter during the Arab Spring, to keep it on, and people are trying to figure that out, right now. So I don't think it's safe to say that the U.S. government is definitively trying to do something, but I do think that institutions have power, and so it's important to have these conversations and understand the types of very salient and challenging things that you're talking about, but how do we bring that back within organizations and amongst ourselves and ask ourselves those questions so that we make sure that the things we know shouldn't happen don't happen. That's helpful.
I guess from the point of view of information technology, I would say American and Western culture is very much embedded into it. I mean, for example, most software assumes that you have a left to right geometry of your language. It also assumes oftentimes that you use 26 letters that are A through Z. And sometimes you have to go back and change it in order to have an accent or some other strange letter that aren't sort of standard. And most software source code and the languages themselves are in English. But I think there's also a ton of new development in the technology space that is coming from places like East Africa and also South Africa that is creating new information technology forms that are different than forms which have been created in Silicon Valley. And so these technologies are being sort of adapted, even if they were originally kind of American, I think.
Speaking about a feedback loop and getting the users involved, the people who are being helped with the aid, how can you ensure that there's not a conflict of interest if they're receiving the aid, they're getting scholarships or money, and perhaps money's getting cut from the top, or getting, there's some corruption at the top, people at the bottom aren't going to know about it. The malaria nets thing seems to be a very good concrete example. What about ones where people are receiving money, and how could you avoid the conflict of interest there?
You're talking about conflict of interest issues or corruption necessarily?
Both. I mean,
Both.
if the user, if you want the user to be involved and the user to help with the funneling of money or the development of the project.
I mean, I don't think there's any easy answer. I think a lot of it is case by case. A lot of it is based, again, on human relationships. The one thing that I would say with regards to ICT is that, there again, there's a tendency to want to use technology as a way to make systems transparent, make them more, less, corrupt. And again, the technology is, really just amplifies the underlying human forces that are there. So, one of the things that people always want to use technology for is, in fact, it came up earlier this morning, was, let's make governments less corrupt by using the technology as a way to make it transparent. But, the technology only does what is already there in the culture. So to the extent that the government is so thoroughly corrupt that they don't feel any need to respond to, citizen complaints, it doesn't make a difference how many issues of bribes that you report. They won't change their ways. Conversely, if it's a government where leadership and the management are very dedicated to rooting out corruption, then you can use technology in a way to root it out.
But not just the government, but an NGO, for example, they have an incentive to be transparent. How can, there's still a conflict of interest there. How can that be?
yeah, I'm not sure that there's an easy answer. I think that's a tough
Well,
question.
and you're talking about a very specific example around disbursements of funds, right? So, I think that there are a lot of existing systems in place just to make sure that those funds are being used accurately, what's happening, as opposed to you giving me money and me saying, oh, I still feel sick, so I need some more money, And so I think that it's really important to kind of look at that particular grant-making mechanism, whatever it may be, and see what's required versus just generally in terms of service delivery, trying to get feedback. If we look at how marketers in the US study every single piece of your Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, and turn around and tell me, what women want, which is there an actual article around that, there's not a reason, given the rate that Facebook is being used and Twitter is being used, certainly with the free Facebook access in Africa, that we couldn't be looking at some of these additional techniques just to get information. Now, does that address the question of funding and conflict of interest? No, but I'm also suggesting that we shouldn't make the perfect the evil to the good either.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is, well, it seems from what you've all said I feel like this workshop should almost be renamed to kind of create more of a partnership around civil society, social movements, and bringing technologists, ICT folks, as being social activists. And I think user-led leads to this idea of individual, and I think and that speaks to why what you were saying, that the Arab Spring wasn't just social media. No, it wasn't, because social is not an individual, it's a community movement, it's a national grassroots movement. And I want to speak to an example that I think counters a little bit what you said, a little bit about China being not discontent. I was working at a health and human rights group in China where they had built a strong civil society group, but on the other hand, we were using QQ groups, which is still some technology being used there to organize gay men in China to group together. But that was one component. But the other social component, which I think is the definition of social, which I think is a misnomer of social media, there's multiple definitions of social, was gathering gay men in the parks of Beijing together to meet and talk after they had already met on the QQ group, or vice versa. We had sex workers, female sex workers and male sex workers, who were using text messages to communicate to each other that there was that there were going to be trainings from lawyers around their legal rights and what they were. But on the other hand, you have civil society that says to them, a larger government that says, well, we can control these type of organizing, whether that be in a media context, is that in a social physical sense, or is that in a social sense in a internet presence? So I think the conversation is much more complex and speaks to where I think people who are in technology need to be trained as social activists, and so social activist folks need to be trained in technology.
Yeah, so there's a great paper by Phil Agri, who used to be a computer scientist and then gradually moved into information science, and he has a paper called, I think it's called Real-Time Politics, where he basically also puts forth a theory of the internet as an amplifier of political forces. And I think what you're alluding to is just the complexity of the underlying political forces. And so, when the technology amplifies those things, the result is not necessarily predictable. But that's not to say that the effect isn't that ultimately is some kind of amplification effect. And I would say, I'm not suggesting that everybody in China is completely happy, but the balance of unhappiness is not yet, has not yet reached a point where average people are sufficiently unhappy with their government that they're willing to risk their lives to protest. Whereas, on the whole, that was obviously not the case in the Arab Spring. And what I'm saying is that, for China to, China may very well get to that point in, 5-10 years. I'm sure that will begin to happen, especially as the economy slows down. But that will be for reasons that are fundamentally not about the tools that people use to communicate. The tools they'll use to communicate might accelerate that a little bit faster, but it won't be the fundamental cause of any kind of revolution.
Which might speak to the broader definition of social. What is social?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm saying that the technology will even amplify other human intents, whether they're social or not. So what I mean by that is, if the government has a desire to suppress In fact, China has one of the most efficient censorship systems online. But that just goes to show how much the technology is being used by the government to amplify its own agenda. There's a great book by Evgeny Morozov called The Net Delusion, where he actually goes all on the dark side of how governments end up using the internet against their own citizens. I think he basically, there's a tendency for all of us who want to see positive things out of technology to just highlight all the positive effects. He tends to go on the other side. But if you look at all of those things together, what you tend to see is, again, it's an amplification. So whatever the forces are, if it's positive, technology amplifies the positive. If it's negative, technology amplifies the negative.
So, sometimes, though, you seem to use the word amplify in a somewhat negative sense. And, I think amplification is the difference between a guy playing guitar and a rock concert. Amplification matters.
Right. So I'm not saying that amplification doesn't matter. What I'm saying is that if you're looking at only the positive things that get amplified, you're missing the whole picture. So KwaZulu-Natal came up. One of my colleagues who's at the university there, she studied the way that people shift their income for mobile phones, especially in the less than $1 a day bracket. And it turns out that people who otherwise would spend over 50% of their income on food will gradually shift some of their consumption expenses towards keeping their mobile phones topped up, where previously they would have used it for nutrition and or education, right? And it's just, I'm not saying that that's fundamentally bad, but it's just an amplifying of what people want to do with their money. And the freedom is being used in a way that you might not necessarily think is productive.
Yeah.
These are hard things, right? I agree. These are it's hard questions
The guy
about.
who's only making $1 should not spend 50 cents on a mobile phone.
No, I completely agree. But if your goal is to see the next generation of kids more educated, you might say, well, this is not achieving that goal, at least simply by having the phones out there.
So on that note of lively debate, I think we'll have to close out this session, but thank you so much to the panelists and for everyone joining in the conversation. It's left us a lot to think about.